dear colleagues, dear friends, I'm very pleased to be speaking at this new project aimed at bringing nations closer together, finding common denominators, coming up with recommendations to help the entire humankind to live as their ancestors want them. So this platform, created at the initiative of President Putin, should consolidate the social, economic, scientific, technological, and cultural potential of our country, aiming to accelerate its dynamic, pushing forward our experience, our traditions, our ideals in our dialogue with the world community, which hopefully will start today. We're gathering here on the 4th of November, Day of Unity, day celebrating the feat of the People's Militia led by Minin and Pozharsky, liberated Moscow from Polish intervents and their allies 412 years ago. This is a bright example of things that a nation united by common goals can do. One of the goals of today's symposium is the future of the multipolar world fully reflects the discussion that's currently unfolding in academic circles in Russia and abroad. It's hard to imagine now, at the end of 1990s, what many thought to be the end of the world, the onset of Pax Americana, when all affairs in the world would be supervised by the United States. Back then, in that time, prominent public figure Yevgeny Primakov formulated and started advocating the innovative idea of multipolar world. Very few of our international partners and very few people actually in Russia were ready to endorse that philosophy back then. But Primakov's ideas were shared by our Chinese friends, with whom in 1997 we signed a joint declaration on the multipolar world and shaping a new world order 27 years ago. That was the first ever international political document on this matter. Now we see that the forecasts of Primakov, his allies, were correct. The global balance of power is going through revolutionary changes. This is due to objective trends in the world economy, where positions of the global south and global east are getting stronger, and the share of the global purchasing parity 2024, by the end of 2024, will be 37%, vastly exceeding that of the G7. The economic uprise allows more and more non-Western states to strengthen their national sovereignty and pursue their own course in their domestic and international policy. Just like Russia, those countries speak for democratization of international processes for a multipolar world. They become more and more resilient to external intervention. And this shows in international politics, in growth of interest to unions such as SCO and BRICS. I'm sure everyone was impressed by the Kazan summit, which gathered together delegations from 37 countries, and BRICS received more than 30 requests for either membership or establishing special relationships with the Union. Now, it is a fundamental element in the forming of a polycentric world, which has its supporters and open enemies. Not everyone is ready to accept the natural course of things. The Western community, which once got the lead due to great geographic discoveries, development of capitalism, and basing their well-being largely at the expense of colonial empires, wanted to retain its privileged position. The United States, their allies, tried to revive the spirit of the Cold War and speak about the need to eliminate certain threats originating from Russia, China, and other countries pursuing an independent national policy. After the beginning of the special military operation in Ukraine, Washington and their satellites, within the so-called hybrid war, performed what is nothing short of sanctioned aggression against our country, imposing over 21,000 sanctions against our country in economy, finance, trade, investments, mass media, culture, and sports, and in general, human contacts. Such neo-colonial practices of the West mostly damage developing countries of Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and such trade limitations hurt the poorest countries, depriving them of food, fertilizers, and basic technology, let alone state-of-the-art and advanced scientific developments and achievements. The other side of this fight is that the West is hurting itself, destroying the global labor distribution system that has been spreading across the world since the beginning of the 1990s. Countries of the West immediately forgot principles like fair competition, private property, the benefit of the doubt, and many others. And dollar, touted for decades as the treasure of humanity, was turned into a weapon of suppression of those who refused to obey. And thus, basically, dollar was doomed as the world reserve current currency and means of international settlements. So the United States and their allies, with their own hands, destroy the international system that they have been relying on for years. Let me remind you the words of President Putin. He said in Kazan, by developing new bank payment systems, we do not act against the dollar. The United States itself takes dollar out of circulation because more and more countries start to fear that they might become next. And what they might be punished for, nobody knows, because it totally depends on the folly of American officials. And the United States and the West don't stop short of blackmailing or brute force. After 2022, the goal was announced to deliver a strategic defeat to the Russian Federation. The same plans were entertained by London and Washington in May 1945. Before World War II was over, a plan called the Unthinkable was developed to destroy and dismember the USSR in May 1945. And now the Anglo-Saxon states expect to defeat our country with the hands of the Kyiv regime. And if the Zelensky regime fails that as well, they are preparing a continental Europe to go into a suicidal venture by starting an open conflict with Russia. The elites of the Western countries see no future for them in the multipolar world, and they seek help with their American sovereign. Germany humiliatingly agreed with the terrorist attack and destruction of the Nord Stream. And now Berlin nods obediently when the United States decides to deploy medium-range ballistic missiles in Germany. Chancellor Scholz only called this good. We hear reckless propositions about strikes with American long-range missiles inside Russia's territory. This greatly reduces the chances of any potential party to this war to have any role in the multipolar future. The desperation of the situation that the Western elites find themselves in reflects in the politics of their states. The West never has enough. The war that they're waging against Russia in Europe is not enough. At the NATO summit, they confirmed the leading role of the alliance in the Asia-Pacific region as well. If we read the NATO declaration, it reads that to defend the territory of its members, this defensive, mind you, alliance is going to fight defensive wars in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, thousands of miles away from their shores. All sensible observers realize that this is a way to nowhere. But the United States has been consistent in deploying NATO infrastructure in the Pacific, making no secret of their goal of increasing pressure on China and Russia in the Pacific territory, at the same time undermining the security architecture of the ASEAN in the Pacific territory that took decades to be built on the base of equal rights, taking into account mutual interests. In place of the open mechanisms created around ASEAN, the United States has been stepping forward with AUKUS and Quad and various other unions involving South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. They're trying to drag some ASEAN members there as well, aiming to undermine this association with the goal of eliminating competition here. Obsessed by this obsession with the need to control everything led to a number of catastrophes in the Middle East. The United States invasion of Iraq under the false pretext of finding weapons of mass destruction, and the tragedy in Libya, tragic consequences not only for Libya but some African countries as well. This year, Anglo-Saxon aggression fell upon another UN state, Yemen. And the Syrian Arabian Republic still can't recover from America's intervention. The United States has essentially blocked all multipolar mechanisms that might help to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And currently, Washington continues their attempts, inventing improvised negotiations formats, coming up with suggestions that allegedly can stop the bloodshed in the Gaza Strip. With these initiatives, the number of casualties is still growing, mostly affecting children, women, and elderly people. Over 1 year of Israel's operation in Gaza, twice as many innocent people in Gaza died, and the number of casualties on both sides in Ukraine. 10 years after the neo-Nazi coup, almost twice as many. When America and its satellites deal with international problems, they only have one thing in mind: to retain their privileged position and be in control of everything, while the lives of common people get very little attention. But the fundamental threats that the world is facing require an equal distribution of power. Apart from military conflicts, it applies to the need to ensure democratic methods of using new technologies, including artificial intelligence, adapting to climate change, joint exploration of outer space, prevention of epidemics, and overcoming social, economic, and digital inequality, fighting famine and poverty and many other areas that will determine the future of humankind. Our diplomatic contacts, including those made at the BRICS summit in Kazan, allow to make one conclusion. It is obvious that confrontation and hegemonism are harmful and do not help to solve even the one problem. The Global South and the Global East are defending their right to be full agents in the entire spectrum of international life as the result of increased international activity of non-Western countries. The role of intergovernmental blocs in Asia, Africa, and Latin America is growing. This is, first of all, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN, Eurasian Economic Union, the Commonwealth of Independent States, Collective Security Treaty Organization, the League of Arab Countries, and the Gulf States, and the Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative. As for Africa, members of the African Union are more and more consistent in fighting that their resources get to international market not as raw materials, but as high added value products. This step towards elimination of neocolonial practices will radically change the trade balance in favor of the African countries. Similar processes are gaining momentum in Latin America and in Asia. That has been for many years the engine, the locomotive of the world economy. An important step towards multipolarity will be establishment of direct contacts and horizontal ties among all those regional integrational structures, among themselves and with BRICS, where globally, which represents the states that are leaders in their respective regions, and BRICS can serve a harmonizing structure, allowing to softly coordinate approaches integration unions of the global East and the global South. And de-dollarization of the world economy that I have already mentioned is another step in that direction. The share of national currencies in Russia's settlements with SCO countries and Eurotech countries has exceeded 90%. And in BRICS, we're about to hit the 65% mark. And this figure is growing. Russia will continue playing an important role in this process, considering our position as the fourth biggest economy, according to the IMF, in global purchasing parity, and work on creating new payment platforms started in BRICS under Russian chairmanship and will be continued by our Brazilian counterparts in 2025. Experts forecast not only an increase in the share of national currencies in the world trade, but also the formation of several macro regions with their own standards, norms, regulations, and added value chains. In a situation where egotistical actions of the United States brought to a situation where the once global system is quickly getting fragmented, the trust towards dollar is falling quickly. But in any situation, we will continue strengthening the mechanisms of the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and other structures in the Eurasian continent and other parts of the world, opening new horizons of truly beneficial and equal cooperation that benefits all its members without exclusion. In this context, we will continue pushing the concept of great Eurasian partnership, which will provide a foundation to implement another initiative of President Putin to build an architecture of single and indivisible security in Eurasia, an architecture that will be open to any state of our continent, willing to work together on searching for mutually acceptable decisions and solutions. This topic was the focal point of a conference in Minsk that took place recently in Minsk, bringing together delegations from many states from all over Eurasia, including Western Europe. We want the countries of the Eurasian continent, the biggest continent, the most quickly developing, to decide their fate on their own without external intervention, and make sure that the great Eurasia makes its contribution into the formation of the great multipolar world. I want to emphasize that we're not denying the need for dialogue with the West. although we do remember how our Western neighbors denied all agreements and how they undermined the trust towards themselves. We made conclusions for that. And when they are mature enough to renew contacts and build relationships on principles of mutual respect and balance of interests, this is when we're going to decide on how to view such propositions, taking into account our own national interests and not the wishes that we've been hearing from Western capitals. In July, under our chairmanship, the Security Council of UN hosted an open debate devoted to principles of coexistence of states in a multipolar world. We came up with a series of practical steps aimed at restoring trust and stabilization of international situation. We will continue this dialogue on other platforms as well. At the G20 in Rio de Janeiro, the West still tries to extract unilateral advantages, not stopping shy of any methods, including privatization of secretariats of international organizations. This shows in the Organization of Cooperation and Security in Europe. It shows in the Secretariat of the United Nations, where due to obsolete and inefficient criteria forming the Secretariat, there is now too many representatives of the West in all departments of this respected organization. And they really start to serve the interests, openly serve the interests of the West. While driving here, I read a post by Novosti news agency about an official statement of the UN Secretary General at a press briefing. When asked about what he thinks about reports of Russia's and North Korea's plans in the military sphere, he said that those reports cause very deep anxiety because they lead to internalization of Ukrainian crisis. So the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General, is firmly in favor of settling the Ukrainian conflict on the base of the UN Charter and the General Assembly resolution. 2 comments on this spot. Internationalization of conflict is something that the Secretary General remembered about 3 years after the West had trained Ukraine for the war and governs this war directly on the ground. A fact that has been confirmed many times. But back then, the United Nations leadership was not worried about internationalization of the conflict. Second, we all want to be governed by the United Nations Charter and by the resolutions of the General Assembly. Let me remind you in this connection that when West, with full support of the UN Secretariat, demands to restore Ukraine within the borders of 1991, they refer to the principle of the UN Charter about respecting the territorial integrity of all the states. They also refer to a series of resolutions that was accepted with a split voting in support of Ukraine's calls for restoring its territorial integrity. This sounds true because there are such propositions and terms in the UN Charter and in the resolutions, but part of the truth is worse than lies, because before mentioning territorial integrity, the United Nations Charter recognizes the right of nations to self-definition, which started the greatest process of decolonization. And long before the events in Ukraine, in 1980, there was a declaration on principles of relationships among states on the basis of their right for self-determination. And it says everybody has to respect the territorial integrity of the states, that respect the right of nations to self-determination, and thus have governments that represent all the nations residing in this territory. And then, unlike all those amendments provocatively thrown in after the beginning of the special military operation, the declaration that I am quoting is the result of a common consensus. And the regime, the junta that came to power in 2014 in Ukraine, taking a number of state institutions by force, one of the first goals they declared was extermination of the status of state language, of Russian language in Ukraine. And they were going to assault the Crimean parliament. Did those people represent the population of Crimea, Donbass, and the new Russian territories? So the General Secretary really needs to tell its representative to think better about construing the regulations of the UN Charter and read not only the parts of it that are convenient at the moment. When in 2008 Kosovo was declared by the West independent, nobody in the West even argued about this, and the International UN Court ruled that if part of the state decides to unilaterally proclaim it independent, the consent of the central power is not necessary. But the very first article of the UN Charter, one you can't miss if you read this document seriously, says everybody has to respect human rights, rights of any person regardless of their race, gender, language, and religion. That's the UN Charter. I haven't heard a single comment from an official representative, Mr. Guterres, about the extermination of Russian language in Ukraine, in all its spheres, be it education, culture, mass media, or everyday life. I haven't heard a single statement regarding the recent law on the liquidation of the canonic Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And all this language and religion, according to the UN Charter, is something that must be respected. And so in the multipolar world, we're often asked what will be the foundation, the international legal foundation for a multipolar world. We don't have to go looking for some new principles. All of them are already there in the UN Charter. Trouble is that these principles have never been fully respected by our Western counterparts and partners. First of all, the principle that says the UN is based on sovereign equality of all states. After the establishment of the United Nations, we just can look through the history of conflicts. There was not a conflict where the United States and its Western allies were governed by the principle of sovereign equality of states. They have never respected any state and held it for a partner that can be respected. So we think it is a great achievement that the BRICS summit in Kazan, this declaration approved by all leaders, unanimously. It says specifically, related to the Ukrainian conflict, to respect the goals and principles of the UN Charter in all their fullness and interconnection, not selectively, as is the case today. And today, in this time of rapid changes, we are interested that academics, futurologists, scientists, visionaries, who can think out of the envelope, look in the future and contribute to the modeling of today's processes and modeling new forms of international organization that will be up to today's reality, and that, I am convinced, should be based on the ever-relevant principles of the United Nations Charter. And if these are not fulfilled, it's not because they are bad or unfair, because the West doesn't want to adhere to them exactly because they are good and fair. And this is why they're not aligned with the system that the West has been creating, that it is striving to preserve. We think in work like this, it's important to be governed by facts and sober analysis, but at the same time be bold and brave when visualizing the system of the future that we're going to be discussing today. And Russia is willing to join the group that will show its intellectual leadership and the 1,000-year-long history of our state achievements and state governance. And this will serve a powerful stimulus for our civilian society. And I assure you that diplomats will be your most reliable allies in this work. In conclusion, I would like to say your symposium is called a sci-fi symposium. I'm sure that its scientific part is guaranteed by the high level of the experts that have gathered here. And as for the fi part of your agenda, the discussions here will give a lot of food for thought for practicing politicians. And I wish you contribute to, let me suggest that you think about how and when the West comes to senses. I would like to suggest that we fantasize about that. That could be an interesting story to think about. In the West, there are lots of sensible people there, smart people. When they realize that the neo-colonial way of thinking is bad for the West, that arrogance undermines its reputation. Let's remember Borrell's thought that Europe is a blossoming garden with jungle outside. And Blinken's everybody who is not in favor of democracy will be on the menu. I was shocked that. And I suggest that we think about what the world majority countries can do to help our Western colleagues behave more decently. Thank you.